Um, this is Ian here. I just want to thank you all once again for participating in today's workshop. Um, I'm just going to take you quickly through how I edit a few of these images just to show you and give you a flavor of how I approach editing cosplay. Um, so the first step that I usually do is I will take the SD card from my camera and then pop it into the computer to import the images. Now, when I import the images, I always import the raw images um, because they offer the most flexibility when you edit them. You can edit JPEGs, but they don't offer as much flexibility as a raw file. So that's the first step that I do. I always import all the images as a raw file, and then it's up to you. But I also usually just uh, type in keyword tags or metadata um, for all my shoots. So I'll put the name of the character, Bane or Blade or Cloud Strife. Um, I'll usually pop in a location like Docklands, and I'll also pop in the name of the cosplayer. So in this case, Joey, Morgan, or Steve. If you want, you can also pop in their Instagram handles, just to remind you if you need to search for the images again. It just makes it easier if you do it here. So once you do that and you click import, it will hopefully, if you've done it right, you'll see the images appear in your hard drive as they're imported, the raw images. Um, as you can see, I sort mine according to date, a year, and date. So they're all in this folder here. So now comes the fun part of actually culling your images. Um, as I sort of alluded to before, before we finished up the workshop, um, I try and be as ruthless as I can with my images because often I'll take, um, in this case, I've taken 218 images, um, and I probably want to end up with somewhere around 8 to 12 images. So, but for today's example, I'm just going to pick three. So let's have a quick look. Um, Out of these ones, it's good to look at them on a smaller scale because particularly if you're going to be posting the image to Instagram or Facebook, because uh, those images are usually consumed or looked at on a smartphone. So the images are actually going to be small. Um, in Lightroom, you can actually view these images large. So if I click on this image here and I press E for the loop view, um, you can look at it quite a large size. You can also zoom in if you want. Um, but usually when I press, I'm going to press G now to go back to the grid view. So usually when you look at Instagram, the images are small. So looking at them on a small size like this will usually give you a pretty close approximation of how other people will view your images. And usually you can, if you're just scrolling through these images and none of them catch your eye, that's exactly how, you know, the the viewer is going to view your images on Facebook or Instagram. So I tend to only pick ones that really catch my eye. So just scanning through, that's pretty eye catching. That's pretty eye catching. So I'm going to, let's say I like this image. I want to pick this one. I'm just going to press one, and that puts a little star. So you can Lightroom allows you to rate your images. So you can rate them from 1, 2, 3, 4, or up to 5 stars. So I usually use one to pick do my initial picks, and then as I edit them and I'll gradually move them to 2 stars if I edit them a little bit. But once they reach the final edited stage, I'll put them to 3 stars, and that allows me to then use the filters to then pick rated images, and then that hides all the other images that I haven't looked, that I've rejected or that I don't want to look at. So that's roughly how I do my culls. So in this case, I'm just going to pop it to 1 star to pick that one first. Okay, so I've got one of uh, Blade. Let's see, we've got some Cloud Strife ones. I did a whole bunch of running shots, but a lot of them, one rookie mistake that I still make is to beware of my shutter speeds when it comes to rapid movement. So if I go into the loop view and I scroll through these, you can see that firstly, some of them are not sharp simply because my camera's autofocus isn't that great with keeping up with moving subjects. Um, but also, he is running at quite a rapid pace. Steve, he's quite a nimble fella. So often an image may look sharp on the back of your camera, and it's only a tiny image on the back of your camera, but when you actually zoom in, you'll see that it's not really sharp. It's not as sharp as I would like it to be. Um, Sometimes an image doesn't need to be sharp for it to be effective. Sometimes an image looks good regardless of whether it's, even if it's a little bit blurry. It's all about the dynamic pose, or it could be the motion, or it could be the emotion that's in his face. Sometimes blur is fine. A little bit of blurriness is acceptable, but sometimes I do like it to be sharp. So in this case, uh, the motion for me isn't really, it's about him running, but it still isn't convincing enough for me, so I wouldn't bother with this image. I'll go back to the grid view. So there are a whole bunch of I shot this on a burst mode, so you can sort of see him move through his move through the scene. uh, One thing that I wish um, I had mentioned to Steve to do would be to hold his sword out at a longer angle, because at the moment his sword looks very short simply because it's pointed directly behind him. But if I instructed him to angle his sword out more to the side, then it would look a lot better, because then you see the length of the sword, and it's a big sword, right? So you want to actually see it, see the size of it. Then it would actually, make for a really cool photo. So as you can see that as he starts to turn more, the sword length becomes a bit more. Um, but by then he's way past me. So um, these are one of the times where, as a photographer, you look at your images and you're going, oh, I wish I'd done this. So these are the moments where you got to remember that, okay, I learned my lesson here. Next time when I'm shooting someone with a sword and I want to do this running pose, I got to remember to ask them to angle the sword out a lot more so that I can see the length. So, these are the sorts of questions or points that you bring up into your own mind, and as you critically, assess your own performance of the shoot, if that's the right word of it for it. Something like this where you can see a lot more of the length of his sword. That's pretty cool. So if I zoom into that, that's not bad, but I would have liked to see a bit more of his legs, because if he's moving, I want to see some movement, or at least the appearance of his legs running. At this stage, it just looks like, he's standing and he's sort of leaning forward a little bit. It's not, again, not a very convincing image for me. So all right, anyway, let's move past these running ones. These standing posy ones look pretty cool, but I want to see one that can really show me how large his sword is. So I remember taking one, something like these ones. These ones you can actually see how big his sword is in relation to him. And that's always been one of the key elements of any image with cloud strife, is that his sword is always a huge, massive, oversized great sword that he's associated with. So I want to find an image like that. Keep scrolling. These ones of him with the metal tower behind him. They're okay, but I think it's a bit of a messy background. I like my backgrounds to be a lot cleaner than that. Um, so for that, that's the reason why I'm sort of going past these images. Um, but it could work. It could work. But anyway, I'm just wanting to find that one that I want to edit. Okay, so now these are starting to become more what I'm looking for. You're seeing him and you're seeing how big the sword is in relation to him. This is not a bad image. I kind of like that. It's again, it's not the sharpest, but I'm zooming at 200%. If I stay at 100%, it's not too bad. And if I don't zoom in at all, it still looks acceptably sharp to me. So that's fine. That's actually not a bad image. I might put that as a one. Um, Go back to grid view. One thing I would like to see again, as these and in these further images, I'm seeing more of his sword. So I think this image here might be good. Okay. So this image is good in terms of being able to see more of him, but his sword is blurred because he was moving it. Um, my shutter speed was only at 1/200. And I believe in this scene he was actually swinging his sword around. So with very rapid movement, you 1/200 isn't enough to freeze motion. You'd probably want something more like 1/800 to freeze the kind of motion, because the closer an object is to the camera, the faster it moves across the camera. So you'd need something like 1/800 or something like that to be able to freeze it properly. Again, one of those things to file away for um, future improvement for myself. And now this is what I'm looking for. Okay, if I click on 200%, yep, you can see that his hair is sharp, eyes are sharp, and the sword is sharp. Perfect. I'll pick this one. Great. Okay, so that's rated a 1. Now let's look for some Bane shots. I've got some action shots. I just want some of Bane alone. All right, here we go. Um, so this was one of those ones where I wanted Bane to look like he was addressing an audience with some passion. Um, this is not bad. That's not a bad one. I might make that a 1. What else have we got? Yes, these ones with his arms outstretched. Come to me, people of Gotham. Looks great. Okay, I like this shot simply because Bane's supposed to be this really huge, barrel-chested, imposing villain, right? Um, and this jacket really gives him that size. Um, Having the outstretched arms also makes him look bigger than he is. So one thing I would do with this image, I will make it a 1, but if I do edit this, I will crop in a little lot closer just to make him look even bigger within the frame. Great. So that's 1. Um, this one here is a very iconic Bane pose, but this next image here, this one here, I really like this one. And the reason why I like it is because he really fills the frame, which emphasizes how big he is, not just in terms of his physicality, but as a villain, as a person. He's just such a big character, and I think this image really says that. So I'm definitely making that a 1 star. So I like that a lot better than this one here, because this one, we know he's a big guy, but in terms of the frame, he doesn't actually take up a lot of the frame, a lot of what's in the frame, whereas with this one he does. So that's, in this one he's front and center in your face, so I like that one. So in terms of this one and this one, um, sometimes if you're having trouble telling, if it's easy to just hit the loop view and just use your left and right arrows to scroll between back and forth. So and here you can see it, what a difference just a slight inch to the left or the right, of your camera position can make. And this one, you can definitely see this is a uh, much better angle, because his head and this part of his body looks so much bigger compared to this one, where he just doesn't look as big to my eyes. So that's one thing that has this image winning over this one. Okay, so that's Bane. Um, all right, I think I've got about three or four images to edit. Let's do that. So now that I've starred my images, as I said, what I can do is I can click on the rated and just filter it on the rated images, and straight away it removes all the clutter. Um, so it's up to you, but if you end up having, after your first pass at culling your images, you end up with, say, 20, that's fine. If you want, you can have a second pass at it. And again, you can have a look at this, and you say, all right, if I've got, two images of Cloud Strife in a very similar pose, maybe one is closer and one is more of a pulled back wide angle view, then you make a call, and I say, all right, between these two, which one do I like better? Do I like this one, where um, he is clearly the main character in this scene, or do I like this one, where he's still the character in the main scene because he's the only subject there, but you also get to see how big his sword is in relation to him, and you also get the benefit of the environment that he's in, which is quite cool, which is one reason why we shoot outdoors, because we can capture them in an environment. So In the interest of editing, I will go with this one here, the wider view. So I'll make that a 2-star. Simply because we've got other pictures here which show a close-up of the cosplayer. So like I think I will make this one a 2, and then I will also edit blade and I'll make that a 2. Okay, so that gives us a good variety to go through. We've got one which is more of a medium shot, torso and head. This one is probably more closer to a head shot, which is just him and his upper torso. And then we've got a wide shot with the environment. So that'll give me some variety to edit with, and you guys can see get a little bit more value out of that. So, all right, if I click it on 2 stars, that only keeps it to the ones that I've picked. Okay, so let's start editing this. Um, I've selected this first one. I'll press the D key, D for Delta, to go into the develop menu. All right, so now I'm in the develop menu and I've got access to the the various controls to edit to affect this image. The first thing I usually look at is the histogram. Now, if you're not familiar with the histogram, basically the histogram gives you a distribution um, of the dark, mid, and highlights of your image. All right, so anything on the left pertains to the shadows, anything in the middle pertains to the midtones, and anything towards the right pertains to the highlights or the brightest parts of the image. So if you want to get an idea of, let's say this region, what part of the image does that affect? Notice that it lights up. You can actually click and drag to the left or to the right, and it will actually move the histogram to the left or the right, and you can actually see the impact on the image. So I'm going to click on this part, which is the blacks, and you can see that as I move it up, notice that his black t-shirt is getting brighter, but his face is not getting brighter. Okay, so that tells you that this part of the histogram relates to his black t-shirt and also maybe a little bit of his lower torso and the shadow. Look at his shadow get brighter. Yeah. All right. So and you can also see the black slider move. Okay, so moving this part of the histogram is the same thing as moving the black slider on the controls down there. All right, so I'm just going to leave that there. I'm just going to command or control Z to reset that to 0. And then this part here pertains to the shadows. Notice how the word shadows lights up here in the shadows. All right, and similarly, when I click and drag, again, this time the shadows pertain to the darker parts, but the parts that are not as black, they're not black, but they're slightly brighter, but they're less bright than the midtones. So as I move that, you can see more detail of his costume coming up because his costume is mostly black or mostly very dark. And you'll also see his hair. Notice the details in his hair coming out as I raise the shadows. So that's what the shadows affects. So I'm going to leave that back at 0. Now we come to the midtones. The midtones, when I move these, notice it's the exposure button. It's the exposure slider, sorry. And as I move the midtones, notice that the whole of the histogram moves. So some of the black actually moves up, and the highlights or the brighter parts on the right also move up. Okay, and you can sort of see the midtones tend to affect things like his skin. So if you look at his arms, if you look at his face, it's getting brighter. And also the gray, parts that are very similar in tone, like the shadow to the skin. All right, so that's your midtones. I'm going to undo that, reset back to 0. The next part of the histogram are the highlights. So these are the parts that are not as bright as the pure white, which is what the sword is, but you'll start to see it more around these areas and maybe even the wall. All right, so when I move the highlights, you can start to see the wall getting much brighter. His sword isn't really changing because that's just pure white, which is the next one that we're going to talk about after this. But you can start to see the brightest parts on his skin are also going up, and mainly the wall. Okay. So consequently, I'm going to put that back to 0. And the last part is the whites, obviously. So I'm just going to use the slider instead of moving the whites because I'm running out of space out there. But when I move the whites, You can sort of see it's a lot of the wall as well because the wall is quite bright. Um, but if I pull it back, you can sort of see his sword as well going darker. So those are your whites. All right. The other thing to note also is as I as you move these things up and down the exposure scale, notice these two triangles in the corners. Okay, when they light up, that means that you are moving parts of the histogram outside and you're going to lose data. Okay, so let's say I move the exposure slider all the way out. Okay, you can see that it's starting to clip to white. All right, so and you are starting to lose detail when you start to clip. All right, there's no detail in the sword now; it's just pure white. You're starting to lose detail in the skin as I go brighter. Starting to lose detail in his skin. So that's a bad thing. All right, so that helps you to see and make sure that you don't go. The other thing also is when you highlight, you can see that it lights up red, and that tells you those are the points where you're starting to lose information and detail. Similarly, let me just reset that. Similarly, if I go the other way, and you can see that now the shadows or the darkest parts of the image are clipping, or the and I'm losing detail. So if I click there, you can see that those blue parts down here. Actually, let me go even further. Yep, you can see that I'm starting to lose detail in these parts of his clothing. Um, Generally, I'm okay with losing a bit of detail in the shadows, but I don't want to lose details in the brightest parts because the human eye is very sensitive to the brightest parts of the image. That's where your eye is drawn to. Whereas with the shadows, your eyes aren't really drawn to the shadows, they're more drawn to the bright parts. So you can afford to clip your shadows a little bit if you want, and it's a common thing for people to do. But I always try and avoid clipping the highlights and losing detail there because that's very obvious. Okay, so now we know what the histogram does. Now, by the way, there's no such thing as a right or a wrong histogram, all right? Every histogram can look quite different depending on whatever image you're looking for. The way I use the histogram is just to tell me what's happening with my image. Am I losing detail in the shadows? Am I losing too much detail in the highlights? Also, if my image sometimes is if it's kind of bunched up on this side, and I notice there's still a lot of space here. That's dynamic range that you're not using. So you can afford to make use of that dynamic range to give you more detail. And also, it also helps you tell whether your image is too dark because sometimes when you look at your phone, depending on whether your computer or your phone screen is set to maximum brightness or if you set it to 50% brightness or whatever, it can look very different. But the histogram gives you um, quite an accurate picture of how bright your image actually is. And usually, I try and keep the mid tones in the middle if possible, and that helps you avoid a situation where your image can be either too bright or too dark is if you use your histogram to just judge how much of the whole spectrum of shadow midtones and highlights you're using in your histogram. So ideally you want to try and have a balanced histogram, but again it depends on the image. If it's a nighttime shot, it's natural for your histogram to look something like this because it's night. Similarly, if you're shooting a sunny day at the beach, it's natural for everything to look quite bright because you're out in the sun by a beach where the sand is bright, the sky is bright, the water is kind of bright with all this, the sunlight reflecting of it. So it could be that the histogram looks correct this way. But let's go back. So for now, I've reset everything to as it is. I think the exposure is quite good. I'm happy with it. The highlights are not blown. The shadows are not blown. So one thing I will usually the first thing that I do when I first start the image is um, I don't actually start in this panel here. I'll go to the detail panel, and I'll tell you why. The detail panel affects sharpening. Okay. To me, I don't like to over sharpen my images, particularly with skin. When you over sharpen, your skin can look very gritty. For a guy, it's not too bad, but for women, you do not want to over sharpen skin because all the blemishes like skin imperfections, pores, acne, and all that sort of stuff will really show up when you over sharpen. Um, I can show you what happens when I push the sharpness to maximum. You can start to see his skin become more gritty. All right, when I reverse that, you can see it's sort of smooth. Let me zoom in again for you. Okay, I'm going to max out the sharpness. Can you see how it becomes really gritty? And even things like noise, digital noise becomes over sharpened and very apparent. So it's never a good idea to over sharpen an image. Okay, when you import your image into Lightroom, the default sharpness it applies is 40, and the sharpening applies to everything in the image: the skin, the sword, the hair, the clothing, the walls, all these little spots, everything gets sharpened. All right, so one of the first things I like to do when I come in here is, for guys, generally, I'm happy to keep the sharpening at 40. Guys are not, it's not too bad to have skin detail becoming apparent for guys because, they like to look gritty and masculine. But one thing you can do is you can use this masking slider here, and what I'll do is I'll hold the option, or I think on Windows it might be the start or the Windows button anyway, or the command. Anyway, on the Mac, I'm holding down the option and then I'm clicking and dragging. And as I drag it across, you can see that the white areas is where the sharpening is applied to, and the black areas is where the sharpening is not applied to. All right. So the more I move the slider to the right, the less the sharpening is applied to the whole image, but it's only confined, as you can see, more to the edges. All right, and as I move all the way across, you can see that the sharpening is refined more to the edges, and that's generally where you want to apply sharpening. You want sharpening to be applied to the edges, not necessarily to all the areas within those edges. Okay, so if you look at things on the walls, it's not sharpening the entire wall, it's only sharpening the blemishes or the spots on the wall. And similarly, with things like his arms, the outline of the character, even the details on his costume, it's sharpening, the outlines of his belt buckles, the outlines of the strap on his shirt, the outlines of the sword, which is what you want. Um, if you want a little bit of sharpening on the skins, maybe he's got a tattoo, or maybe he's got, you know some face paint or details on the skin. If you want, you can pull back a bit and let the sharpening occur there a little bit. But generally, I probably sharpen about, normally have it between 65 and 85. Yeah, so it depends. Also, how bright or how white means it's a lot of, most of the sharpening is applied there. And if it's sort of like grayish or speckled, it's not. There's a little bit of sharpening, but not as much. So let's say I'll keep it to about here. Okay, and then I'll release the option key and release my mouse. So that's where the sharpening is applied. First step, apply sharpening. Second step, I'll come back. I'll look at this image going, okay, so Blade is generally a vampire. All right, I know he's a daywalker, so vampires generally don't like the sun, but Blade is a daywalker, so he's okay in the sun. But I still would like it to be a little bit darker. This is quite a bright image and isn't quite characteristic of the Blade universe. Normally when you look at Blade films, a lot of the scenes he's in is nighttime, um, and it's dark. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull the exposure down. That's still a bit too much, so I'll pull the exposure down just to darken the wall. And then the other thing is, by doing that, any adjustment you make to this panel here affects the entire image, everything. All right. So what I want to do is I want to pull the overall brightness of the image down. But as I do that, you notice that Blade himself is starting to go very, very dark, which is not quite what I want, because he's the subject. He needs to be the brightest part in the image. So that's fine. I'm going to pull it down just a little bit more. Now, I need to brighten Blade back up again. Okay, there are a couple of ways you can do this, but the way that I'm going to use is just using a simple radial gradient. Okay, and what this does is it's going to give me this plus icon on my cursor. When I click and drag, it's going to create a circle or a radial gradient, okay? So I'm just going to create something that's roughly around him, okay? And I've let go of my mouse now. So the red area will be what's affected when I make adjustments in this panel, all right? So I'm just going to pull this down a little bit. Okay, now we know that we want to make blade brighter, okay? So I'm just going to push up the exposure a little bit, and you can see that he's coming up. Now, the problem with the radial gradient is you can see that it's quite obvious that that's the effect because it's a radial gradient. So one thing you can do is you can pull it out, and what that does is it makes the transition a lot smoother, okay? If you want, you can also make the inner circle smaller and maybe pull it up a little bit. So that's the transition. So I've made him a lot brighter, but it's also made the wall behind him a lot brighter. So I'm going to pull that back in again. And I'm going to pull it down a little bit more. Okay, so it's made him a bit brighter. Now his arms are a bit dark, so I'm going to have to pull it out again. All right. The other thing we can do also is, because I know we know when we're playing with the histogram that the wall is kind of governed by the whites as well as the highlights. So what I can do is I'm going to pull back the highlights a little bit, and you can see that it's sort of darkening the wall a little bit, so it's not so obvious. And I think that looks good right there, right there. Okay, and I'll go, and then I'm going to click done. All right, so um, this is before. So I've hit the backslash key to go before, and I'm going to hit the backslash key again to go after. Before, after. All right. So it's starting to look a little bit more dramatic. And why is that? It's simply because we're introducing um, a different level of dynamic range. So we've got contrast basically, and contrast basically is the difference between light and dark, right? The more difference you have between light and dark, the more contrast you have, and it looks more dramatic. So the other way you could also do it is you could increase the contrast slider, but again, unless you're using a gradient or a mask, um, this affects the whole image. So generally, that's why I don't do it through that global adjustment first. All right. Okay. So I've done this to him. The other thing that I probably want to do is introduce some color. At the moment, the color is pretty flat. It's black, it's white, and then there's his skin tone. Um, Normally in movies, they use this principle called uh, the teal and orange color grading. So the principle behind teal and orange is that warm colors like orange will pop out of the scene more, and cooler colors like teal or blue will recede into the background. Okay, so what I like to do is I like to go to the color grading panel. And in the color grading panel, it allows you to change the colors or the hues of your shadows. Okay, the shadows, the midtones, and the highlights. So this corresponds to the shadows, the midtones, the highlights. All right. So um, so here's the principle that they use a lot in movies. Shadows tend to be cool. All right. Or before I even touch any of these, you can already see that the shadows here have sort of a bluish tinge. So I want to accentuate that. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this down into the blues, and you can start to see the shadows turn blue. Yeah. Okay, I'm just going to go really extreme. It's up to you. It's up to your matter of personal taste how extreme you go, but I'm just going to go extreme for the sake of the exercise, and I'm going to go to blue. Okay, now shadows go to blue. The other thing I'm going to affect is the highlights. Okay, and I'm going to push the highlights out to orange. Now, why orange? Simply because blue and orange are what we call complementary colors. Okay, the colors on the opposite ends of the color wheel. And color theory generally states that complementary colors work well together because they're on the opposite sides of the color wheel. So I'm going to push this out towards orange. And there you go. So what we have is a blue, a very rough blue or blue orange color scheme, color grade, where you've got the blue in the shadows, and then you've got the orange giving his skin a warmer tone. All right. Now, because I've gone all the way extreme, it kind of looks a little bit off. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull it back. Okay, I'm going to pull it back so that his skin tone isn't so crazy. The other thing you can also do is while you have it at extremes, you can move the hues around so that you can sort of see what it does to the image. So I'm moving the highlights around. As I move it towards green, you can sort of see that, oh, it's starting to look a little bit like the Matrix. And no big secret, the Matrix looks green because of this sort of a color grading scheme. But I'm just going to pull it back so that, and what I'm paying attention to is his skin tone. Okay, I want his skin tone to look sort of natural. And I know the colors are very extreme, so but as soon as it sort of settles around something that's close to a natural skin tone, I'm going to leave it there. And then I'm going to pull back on the saturation. So the further out towards the end of the wheel, the more saturated it is, the closer it is to the middle of the wheel, the less saturated it is. So I'm going to keep it to, whoops, it's a bit too extreme. I'm just going to go a little bit there. And similarly with the blue, with the shadow hues, again, you can swing while it's out in an extreme position, you can sort of skew it around to see what it does. And you can get as creative with this as you like, find something that you think, oh, that looks really cool. If I put it here, maybe he kind of looks like he's in a state of bloodlust, which is appropriate for Bane. Sorry, for Blade. Um, Purple doesn't quite work for him. Um, Orange could work. They do have this thing called a monochromatic color scheme where all your colors are different shades of the same color. So it could be an orange, it could be somewhere between like a scarlet with the red, and then it could be something within the yellow to give him that sort of a look. That's also a possible thing. But for now, let's just go with teal. So something like this. Teal is nice. I like teal. And then I'm just going to pull it back a bit so it's not so crazy. And there we go. Okay, so let's do a before after. So I'm going to hit the backslash key again. Before, where it's black and white, it's fine. But now we've added something, a color grading scheme, and it's sort of starting to look a little bit more cinematic. Now, the next thing I want to do is, okay, so I've put a color scheme there. I think he could use a little bit more pop. So it's still looking a little bit flat. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the basic panel. I'm going to use another another mask, and this time I'm going to create. The first mask we used was a radial gradient. All right, we've already done that. The next one I want to do is use a brush. Now the reason why I use a brush is because now I can selectively just paint on and affect the areas that I want. And what I want to do is I want to make his face pop out a lot more, and also his arms pop out a lot more because that's where the power of the image is, his face and the arms. So I'll use a brush. One thing I like to do is to add some clarity. So I'll show you what clarity does. I'm just going to pop it to about 23 for now, and maybe a little bit more sharpness, about 10. And so you can see that my brush here, you can affect things on your brush like flow. Um, you can also affect things like feather, where the outer ring will become bigger. So if I make the feather small, you can see the outer ring disappears and it's just a very hard brush. But if I pull out the feather, um, the area inside the first ring, the inner ring, will be very very obvious with the clarity. But as it moves from the first ring to the second ring, it's going to feather off. So that's what the feather is. And then density as well, you can use that. But I normally keep everything to 100, and just to show you. All right, so I'm going to paint some clarity. I'm just going to zoom in so that you can actually see what's going on. Okay, so I'm going to paint some clarity firstly on his glasses. Okay, straight away you're sort of seeing this edge here become more well defined. I'm also going to paint some clarity around his nose and then his beard, basically his mouth. And then I'm going to hold down spacebar. When I hold down spacebar, it becomes this little hand icon. While I'm holding down spacebar, I can click and drag any part of the image to move around. Okay, and then once I lift up the spacebar, it goes back to the brush. So that's a handy tip for you. I'm just going to add a bit of clarity to the bright parts of his hair. I'm going to zoom out a little bit. Okay, one thing I like to add clarity to is also things like fists, fingers, hands. So you can make the size of your brush bigger as well if you want to, if you don't want to. At the moment, it's kind of small. I want to paint the whole hand in. I'm just going to make the size a little bit bigger. Okay, and then I'm going to paint in there, and you can sort of see it just brings the arms out a little, or brings the details of the hands out a little bit. Just around the edges here. And you can sort of see the muscle definition starting to come in. It's all very subtle. So when you're applying these things, um, it's a bit like painting. A painter doesn't just paint the whole picture in one stroke of the brush. He applies it in layers. First uh, a light a light layer, then slowly increasing the saturation, and it gets darker and starts painting in little bits. So similarly, we're building this image up in layers. All right, so I've still got the clarity on. I'm just going to paint some more clarity on his things like his buckles. And you can sort of see the detail really come out now. That's really cool. Okay, and down here. So now, if you've overpainted and you think, oh, I didn't really want to do that, one thing you can do is click on the show overlay and it'll show you where you've painted. You can sort of see. And let's say I didn't want to paint on this part. If you hold down the Option key on your Mac, or I don't know what it is on the Windows, I think it's maybe the Alt key. Um, but anyway, if you hold that down, I'll just make the brush bigger. Um, you can erase, you know, if you painted it in an area that you didn't want to, you can erase that. And then I can just click off the show overlay again. All right, so done. Let's do a before after. Before, after. Oh, it doesn't really show the brush. Oh, sorry, you can do it from here. Okay, this is the mask. Okay, so if you click on this eye icon here, it'll hide it, and if you click it, it'll come back. Yeah, so you can see that it's given a lot more definition to his arms. Um, one thing I want to do is maybe click on the mask again. I just want to paint this scar on his face. I think it makes him look very manly. I'll just make my brush a bit smaller. Yeah, there we go. Get that bit of the glasses. The other thing you can do is I'll do is also usually put more clarity into his sword and just draw it down like so. Okay. Sometimes it's not always obvious that whether it's doing anything. Um, if you're not sure, after you've done your painting, what you can do is you can just boost the clarity and see what it does. Yeah, you can see. So this is where you kind of refine it and go, I think that's too much, but I think just a little bit here like that is good. So about 30. All right, done. Okay, so that's all right. Now the next thing when I'm looking at this, I'm still thinking, all right, I think his face could be a bit brighter because the wall is very bright. I want his face to be a bit brighter. So let's do that again. Should be pretty simple. I'm just going to create another radial gradient, and I'm just going to do it just on his face. Long, bring that in a little bit, and I'm just going to rotate it a little bit. Okay, and I'm just going to push the exposure up just a touch, just enough to see how he just comes out a little bit of that image. And if you want, you can drop the highlights just a bit and increase the contrast. There we go. The other thing you can do also is you can rename your mask just to keep yourself organized. So I can rename that to face. I think this one was clarity. And this one was subject. Done. Okay, almost there, I think. I'm fairly happy with this. So one last thing I like to do is to create a vignette. Now, a vignette is basically where the edges of your frame, of your image are darkened. So if I pull the vignette slider down, notice how the edges get brighter, get darker. So now, the reason why I do this is it just subconsciously guides the viewer's eye towards the middle of the image, which is where he is. All right. Whereas if you made it like really bright, he kind of he doesn't really pop out of the image, but the more you do a vignette, it's almost like a frame, an extra frame within the frame. So I like to make it um, subtle, so just enough for people for you to know that it's there, but for the viewer to to not subconsciously realize that it's there, consciously realize that it's there. Because if you made it this, that's very obvious. You can see a circle, and if that's your creative intent, that's fine. That looks okay too. But I like it to be there, but not so obvious that it's noticeable. So something like that is good. Now, the other thing that you might also like to do, it's one of your, if you like things to look very like film, you can add noise or grain. Um, Experiment with an amount. I normally like to go 20 and 20 here. Um, it's generally not too noticeable, um, but I just like to put in a little bit in there just to give it a bit of a filmy feel. But you can make it very obvious if you want. That looks very grainy, and if you when you zoom in, you can also see the grain. Um, so that's way too much. But if I pull it back to about 25 or between 20 and 30, I think is generally amount that I like. um, but it's a personal preference, this one. Okay. Now the last thing is this image still looks quite cold, which is fine if you like it that way. But one thing I like to do is play with the temperature slider as well, just to see if it improves things. Sometimes I find by warming up an image, it just makes it pop a little bit more. So notice that when I warm this up, I'm just sliding it towards orange. You can go too far, or you can go the other end, where if you slide it all the way, it almost looks like a night scene. This is at night, which might be appropriate for Blade. So, but generally, I think I like it a little bit warmer. And you can also play with the tint, so you can make it look green like Matrix, or you can go kind of purpley. Too purple is kind of unnatural to me. That doesn't quite look very right. So I'm just going to undo that and just leave it where it was. And I think that's cool. All right. So now that we've made all the little micro adjustments to the areas that we like, the arms, the face, his outfit, um, you can sort of start to play with these more global adjustments and be very subtle with them. So if you want, I generally like to add a little bit more contrast. Again, it's just a subtle thing, not a lot, something like 10. Um, you also notice that when you look at your histogram, you're starting to lose a bit of detail, which is fine, which is fine. You're not losing a lot, but one way you can see what sort of detail you're losing is if you click on any of these sliders and you drag them, but hold down the Option key. Um, you'll start to see where you're starting to lose things when you move these sliders. All right, so At the moment with the black at 0, you're only losing a little bit of very tiny bit of detail. It's not even worth talking about. So that's fine, the black. And similarly with the whites, um, when you hold down, you can see that it's mostly in the sword, which is fine because his sword is kind of metallic, the light's reflecting off it. So I'm not too fussed about it. In fact, it looks pretty cool there. So that works. Okay, so now that I've got the image all more or less where I want it, what I'm going to do is I'm going to crop it. If you want it to crop it specifically for Instagram, I'm going to press the R key for crop. Okay, and straight away you get this grid. So this is where I was talking about earlier that where when you take a photo, it's often useful to have a little bit of space around it and not to go too tight. Um, because that gives you the ability, gives you a little bit more flexibility when you come to crop it like now. So Instagram is usually 1:1. That's a 1:1 crop. It works for this shot simply because in the background, it's just a plain wall, right? So there really isn't anything wrong with cropping parts of it out if you don't need to. If you want to go a bit tighter. The other thing you can do is you can go really tight. You know, go really tight like this. Maybe I'll just pull this out a little bit. So I'm using the rule of thirds. So the rule of thirds sort of says that anything along these points of intersection is where the human eye likes to move to. And generally, if you place points of interest along these areas here, it results in a very pleasing image. Um, I sometimes follow it, but not always. It's not exactly a rule. It's more like a guide. If you really are stuck to you want to try it out, yeah, give it a try. But otherwise, um, maybe I'll put his eye there, and let's see what that does. So if I hit enter, bang, yeah, that's not a bad shot. I mean, it's tightening it. I think works simply because in the rest of the image there isn't really too much happening. You lose a little bit of shadow of the sword, which is fine. Um, you still got most of his shadow there, and you lose a little bit of his bottom torso, which again is fine because the key defining point of this image is his face and this strong pose, which is defined by his arms. And you still see a little bit of his costume detail there. So I think this is a good crop. And for Instagram, that works. Bang. All right, so that's one image done. I'll go back to grid. Um, oh, sorry. Before I do that, let's do a before and after. So before, after. There we go. I think that looks a lot better. But again, anything that I say here is my own personal opinion and my own creative vision. Yours should differ. I mean, if you want to follow mine, that's fine. That's how I learned. I copied other people's and just see, to look at what I liked or what I didn't like about theirs. And then I took on what I liked and I discarded the ones I didn't like. So I encourage you to do the same and think critically about your own creative vision. All right, going back to the grid, let's do Cloud's image now. So I'm going to hit D to develop. All right, looking at this image and looking at the histogram, again, it's good that I'm losing a little bit of shadow in the detail, but I don't lose anything in the highlights. So I am always very careful with the highlights because digital sensors generally don't like being overexposed in the highlights. I think you can expose maybe half a stop. Some cameras will accept a stop and you can still get back detail from that, but generally it's safe to keep, not to blow your highlights in the first place. Shadows, it's fine, like this part here all look very dark, but notice that when I push up the shadow, hey presto, it's like magic. You're getting all that detail back. All right. But if I overexpose the highlights and if I pull that back, it's not, you can recover some of it, but you lose a lot of detail in things like, especially like clouds, in skin. So you don't want to blow your highlights. You've got a lot more leeway in the shadows, but highlights are, yeah. So that's one thing I always look for. All right. Now in this scene, um, again, it's about his sword, and it's about him, but it's also about the environment, all right? Because that's why I picked this wide shot. So first thing I look for is making sure that well, it's up to you, but I like to. I've got a little bit of an OCD thing, so I like to make sure my horizon is straight. I can't actually see the horizon properly here, but just looking at these lines here of the poles and stuff like that, it doesn't look straight to me. So I'm just going to hit the R button to crop. So it's the same crop view, but if you click outside, notice how my arrow turns into a up and down. So if I click and pull outside, you can sort of see I can rotate the image. So I think I'm using maybe the tree behind him as a guide. Trees don't always grow straight, but generally, if I'm looking to latch onto something, I'll use that. Also, the white smokestack behind his head there, I think that should be straight. So I'll also use that as a guide. Um, and you can also use things like the edge of buildings and things like that. But um, I'm shooting with a very wide angle here, so there usually tends to be some distortion with wide angle lenses. So it doesn't have to be perfectly straight. You can also use. I'll just hit enter for now. If that still bothers you, these things not being straight, you can also go to the transform menu and you can play with the vertical slider. So notice the vertical slider as I move. Notice how I'm looking at this point here, and I'm also looking at these points. All right. So as I move the vertical slider, uh, notice they stay how they stay straight, but also paying attention to the subject. Notice that when I go too far, his head becomes too small, and when I go too far this way, his head becomes too big. So just be careful with this. If you want, you can adjust it slightly, but don't go overboard. So I think maybe slightly this way is fine. The other thing you can do is just click this constrain crop. Um, that way it keeps your image to a square and you don't lose any of the edges. So all right, that'll do for now. Okay, back to basic. Now, I don't know how you guys feel about using, if you use Instagram, they often have filters that you can use to apply to image to give them a very quick look. Um, Lightroom has the same thing under the profile. So if you click that, you'll see a bunch of profiles that you can use. Um, to me, whether I don't really have any views as to whether using these are bad or good. Um, to me, they're just tools. If they help you get the job done, great. When someone looks at your final image, they're not going to ask you, hey, did you use this particular camera profile when you did that, or did you grade it painstakingly 6 hours by yourself? I've never ever got that question. It doesn't matter if it gets you there, if it gives you the result you want. Good, use it. Okay. So for this one, I'm going to play around with some of these camera profiles or filters, if you like. So let's have a look. Pink. No, I don't like it to be too pink. Um, that one is not bad because it kind of looks like a sunset, and it's appropriate because the sun is out. Um, that one is also not too bad, these artistic ones. Um, you also have more modern filters. The modern filters tend to be very contrasty. You can see that compared to this one, where you can see detail in some parts here like that. When you go to modern, that just goes to black. So, but they're a little bit more edgy, which may be suitable for cosplay, especially male cosplays, because edgy is good. Um, but it's a matter of taste again. So it's just going around saying I like this, I don't like that. Um, that's almost black and white. There's a little bit of color, but it's very desaturated. Um, that's not bad. That's not bad actually. Modern number 8, and it's got this faded film look as well in this section here. It kind of looks yeah, I like that. All right, let's start with that. Let's play with this one. Close. Okay, now that you've chosen your color profile or your filter, You can also modify the strength at which it's applied. So if you push it down to 0, this is your original image. And if you push it to 100 or 200, it's the extreme end. It's fully applied. So uh, move it to how you like it. Notice that when you move it all the way out, you lose a little bit of contrast. I mean, it goes very black. So I'll keep it to 100. 100 was good, right in the middle. Okay. Um, the other thing that I want to be careful of is just to make sure that I recover some detail from this part of his hair. So to do that, I'm going to use a brush, and then I'm going to pull back on the highlights a little bit. So let's just say -20 for now. Just going to zoom in a little bit. Space bar to get the hand, and then just drag it across, and then lift up the space bar. Okay, I'm just going to make my brush a little bit bigger. Now look, I've got -20 on the highlights. Let's paint that in, and you can start to see a bit more detail of his hair come back. Oops, I don't want to. I don't want to paint his skin, so I'm going to go option, make the size a lot smaller. I'm just going to erase this part here. Okay, so just a little bit. If you want, you can also pull the highlight all the way back and see a lot of detail come back, which might be good. Um, or you can just keep it really subtle. So I think I like seeing a little bit more detail come back. So I'll pull it down to about 45 now, and it's done. Okay, yeah, so that's cool. You can see a little bit of the detail in his hair now. The other thing that I want to do is I also want to pull a little bit of the detail out from this part of the scene here because I think it's a bit too dark. So one way I can do that, you can use a brush if you want. Create a mask, get a brush, and then just do something like as we did, push up the shadows or even push up the exposure a little bit. Make your brush really big. Oops, too big. And then just start to paint it back. That's one way you can do it. Um, all right, I'm just going to undo that. The other way you can do it also is to create a mask using a linear gradient. So a radial gradient made it round. A linear gradient will be a line. So if I click and drag this way, you can see that the linear gradient is a diagonal line. And depending on where you move your mouse, you can make it straight or you can make it vertical. Um, but since it's only this part in the corner, I'm just gonna drag it like this. Okay. Now I'm just gonna increase the exposure a little bit. Not too much, because I think it's cool the way it is. Um, a little bit. Now, if after you're doing that, you can still click and drag the gradient, and then you can start to see a little bit more of that detail come back. Cool. Let's go. We'll go with that. All right. So now there's a little bit more of the scene available to him. Um, this part's clearly in the sun. This part's clearly in the shadow. Let's start to pull some detail out of him now. Um, I want him to pop out of the image a lot more. So I'm going to go back to my good old brush with clarity. So brush, um, let's go with the clarity to about say 20 and the sharpness to say about 20. Make my brush small and let's zoom into his face. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to paint over his eyes because the eyes are really important. And just his mouth down here, just this part of the nose. The other thing I'm going to paint over is just these little details in his armor. Notice how, especially things that are already bright with a little bit of contrast, they really just pop. And then there's this little belt buckle here. Just going to get some detail on this collar here. And when I paint, notice that I'm focusing on the bright parts as opposed to the dark parts. So when you do that, you start to see the detail really come out when you use clarity. Just going to zoom out a little bit. A bit on this belt, this chest piece here. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to paint in some details on the sword. Um, you can paint in this shadow part if you like, but do you notice how you can start to see that it brightens it up a little bit, which doesn't really look nice because you've got you can basically see where you've painted it, right? So I don't paint it in the darker parts. I keep it to the edges because the sword's in shadow. That's why I don't do that. Um, Again, just keeping it to the darker parts of him, um, down here and down here, just a little bit. Now, you can do his hair. Let's go in and just get some clarity on certain parts of the hair, so like just the edges. Cool. I think I'm happy with that. Done. All right, let's look at the before and after. So before, after. Okay, so that's already looking pretty good. Um, oh, one thing I didn't start with, which the reason why I didn't was to play with the masking. So if you want, you can do the masking thing again. Hold down Option as you drag. Um, Now you're going to see a lot of things being sharpened because there's just so much foliage in this image. But but generally I still do this step. So yep, that's done. Okay, the last thing we can do is if you want, you can. There's already sort of like a color grade applied to this with the color profile that we've chosen. But if you want, you can still play around with the color grade and just see what happens if you want. So let's go something extreme. Um, Move it around. To me, it doesn't really look that great because the color profile already has it there. But if you want, you could make it look, just introduce a slight bit of blues into the shadows. And similarly with the highlights, you can just introduce, uh, let's see, what's a good one? That one probably looks okay. Just a little bit of yellow, just a slight bit of yellow in there. And then you can play with the balance. So the balance affects the balance between the shadow and the highlight hues. So if I go towards the shadows, you can see it becomes a little bit more blue. If I go towards the highlights, it becomes a little bit more warmer. So it's up to you where you want it. I think warmer is better simply because it suits the scene a bit more. I'll go warmer. And if you want, you can play with the midtones as well and see what that does. That gives it more of a red feel, which isn't very Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy is quite blue generally. So that makes it look a little more like dusk or dawn, where it's a little bit darker. And green is just weird. So um, if you want, I would be subtle if you want to play around with this. The red could look cool. Yep. But otherwise, just double click in the middle to reset everything. So I'll leave the midtones as it is. Okay, we're almost there with this one. Last thing I want to do is I think I want to see if I can change the color of the sky a little bit. So I'm going to go into HSL, which stands for hue, saturation, and luminance or color. So let's talk about hue, saturation, luminance. Hue is basically the color itself, whether you want it to be very red or tending more to orange, or with the greens, whether you want it to be tending more towards teal or cyan, or you want it to be tending more towards yellow. So that's the hue. Now the saturation is how intense the color is. So do you want a very intense red, or do you want it to be kind of, not so intense, more desaturated, more towards gray? Um, and finally, luminance is the brightness of the color. So a very bright red. The brighter you go, the more lighter the color will look because you're making it brighter. And the darker you go, it'll start to go dark, but if at the extreme end, it'll become very black. So these affecting these three will uh, these three affect what the color the end color looks like. So let's take an example. Let's look at the red hues. If I push the red hue, actually red's probably not a good idea because there's not much red in this image. Let's do yellow. There's a lot of yellow in this image. So if I move, if you notice the grass behind him turning really green, and similarly if I move it the other way, it's sort of tending at this end of yellow, it's moving more towards the red, and the grass has become red. So this is one way to be creative with some of the colors and just have a play with it, um, and just playing around with the hue. Let's just reset that. You can also, what else is in the scene? You can just go through all the sliders and see what changes, the greens change, the yellows change. Sometimes like things like magenta, I'm not sure if you'll get much magenta in this. There's hardly any magenta in this. So moving the slider doesn't do anything. The other magic thing you can do is this little button here. If you click on that, you get this little arrow, interesting little icon. What you can do is you can click on any part of this image and drag up or down, and it will change the hue of that image because we're on the hue, right? So let's pick this part of his hair. If I click and drag, notice it will change anything in this image with that color. All right. Notice how it changes. But because that color is the same in his hair as well as the grass, that's why you're also seeing the grass change. Okay. But it could be, that looks like he's on Mars, or that looks like a very artistic shot. I kind of like that. That's pretty cool. But I'll leave it up to you. And as you can see, as you move up and down, the orange and the yellow sliders on the right move in concert because that particular spot where we sample that color is made up of orange and yellow. Okay, so that's hue. So I'm just going to go Control Z to undo. You can do the same thing with saturation. All right, so with the yellows, let's do that. If I pull back the saturation on the yellows, you can notice the grass go all gray because I've pulled all the color out of it, which is the definition of desaturation. And similarly, if I oversaturate it, you'll start to see it looks very, very, very vibrant. Okay. And that's the other thing interesting that you'll see with grass and foliage. A lot of the time we look at it when we go, hey, that's green. Actually, no, it's made up more of yellow than green because you can sort of see what it's doing there. Yeah, cool. Anyway, random thought from Ian Tan. And similarly with the saturation, you can use this little button here to increase or decrease the saturation. So let's say I want to change the saturation on this blue, I can pull it back, and that actually looks quite cool. Or I can make it a lot saturation, and then this whole sword becomes blue. So I actually will pull it back a bit because I like the look of that. It kind of suits him. Yeah. So I will do that. I'll leave it a little bit of blue in, not too much, but generally I think I like the look of that better. Okay, done. So I've pulled down the saturation of his blue, and that's done. Click on done. And lastly, luminance. Um, Again, you can make the luminance of like say blue brighter, darker, and this is what I was hoping to do with the sky, because we know skies are mostly blue, right? So if I darken the sky, or if I darken the blue, which is mostly in the sky and a little bit in the sword, it actually looks pretty dramatic. A dark sky is more dramatic than a bright, featureless sky. So the other way I could have also done it, if I undo that, is again using this button here and just clicking on the sky and just pulling it down to darken it. And as you do that, just keep an eye on what else in the image is being affected. So far, it looks like only his sword is being darkened. Um, so that's not too bad. So that's one of the disadvantages of using this particular panel. Again, like the basic panel, it's a global adjustment. It affects everything in image. But sometimes if you just use it judiciously, uh, it's actually not too bad. So I think I will darken the sky a little bit, not too much. There we go. That should do. Done. All right. So let's do a quick before after. So hitting the backslash key again, before and after. I think that's an improvement. And sometimes you have to be honest, going that does it really look better or does it not? And if it doesn't, just hit the reset button down here and start again. All right. There's the only thing you lose is time, but time spent in experimenting is always a learning experience. So I don't think it's wasted time, even if you do have to reset and start again. All right. So we've done that. Um, I think it's a lot better simply because it it's got that is again it's got a little bit more of a cinematic look. With this one, it looks more like an image taken with, let's say, one of your old film cameras, but with very glossy film. So it's kind of very sharp, very contrasty, very polished. Whereas with this one, it looks a lot more gritty. The color is a bit more romantic, and it's got this faded gray film-like look over it, which is quite appealing. Lastly, the thing I want to do probably is just to maybe add a slight vignette, very slight, very very slight. If you want, you can add a bit of grain, which I will do. 2020 again. And finally, with the basic panel, I think I'll just reintroduce a little bit more contrast into this shot. A little bit more contrast. And then push the exposure up just a touch. There we go. So that pops just a little bit. Um, I, I do know that the skin is probably on the verge of being overexposed. Looking at this Instagram, it's not quite, but it's almost there. Uh, but that's fine, simply because it's quite a gritty image. So there's very good contrast between two sides of his face, which draws the eye. The eye goes towards the brightest parts of the image, and the eye also goes to the parts of the image that are very high contrast. So that is very cool. Um, Now, do we think I should crop this? What I'll do is I will crop it. Now, I'm going to crop it this time instead of 1:1. You could crop it 4:5. That's also a very Instagram friendly crop, 4:5. And by doing that, you lose this tower here, which is fine. I don't think that's a big deal. You also lose a little bit of stuff here, which there's nothing here. There's nothing of interest here. So that again, that's not a problem. Um, if you want, again, you can use this rule of thirds to put him there. But I'm happy just having an equal amount of space here and here. Um, that's fine with me. The other thing I want to experiment with is also the 16:9 crop. Now, the 16:9 aspect ratio is something that's very iPhone friendly, in that when you rotate this image and look at it on your iPhone in landscape view, it will fill the entire iPhone screen or the entire phone screen. So, and that's also a bit cinematic because it's like your wide angle view when you look at video. So that's not a bad look. Only thing is on Instagram, when you post this on Instagram, you you lose a lot of the top and the bottom real estate. So for if you're going to put this exclusively on Instagram, um, I would suggest the 4:5 or the 1:1. But with 16:9, this would make really good wallpaper for your computer or to look at on the iPhone. So it's a personal artistic choice, and it should be guided by where your image will end up on. So I'm going to go with 4:5 since this is probably going to end up on Instagram. Um, and also, I'm just going to open it up a little bit more. Just make sure I catch enough of his feet. Make sure there's enough room so that I don't cut his legs off. Um, I don't mind cutting that tower out, and I want to have enough space between the edge of the sword and the edge of the frame. Um, in fact, I can come in a little bit tighter. Okay, I'm happy with that. Yep, yep, definitely happy with that. Now, the other thing is, looking at this, it doesn't look, I may have over-rotated it in terms of getting it straight. So this looks crooked to me. So I'm going to rotate it back a little bit more, like this. Yep, done. Okay, quick before, after. Before, after. Before, after. Now, one last thing is this little bit of grass bothers me, so I'm just going to drop the brightness on that. So just quickly create a brush, drop the exposure, drop the shadows a little bit, make my brush about that size, a bit bigger, and just click on it once just to darken it. Maybe just paint this area like that. Before, after. Okay. Oh, sorry, not wrong. Before, after. Here we go. Before, after. Yep, definitely better. I'm happy with that. Done. Okay, last image. Bane. All right. Um, One of the things I instantly like about this image is just the detail in his mask with the light reflecting off the edges. Oh, that looks killer. Also, his pose is really great. You know, the outfit, that's just straight out of a movie, that shot. So um, let's see what we can do to strengthen it. So firstly, I think it needs a little bit of color treatment. It looks fine as it is, but let's have a play with the color and see what we can do. Okay, so firstly, let's start with the detail. Um, Again, with a guy, we don't have to be too overly concerned with skin detail, but we don't want to unnecessarily sharpen things that don't need to be sharpened. So hold down the Option key, drag the masking um, until it's about there. So about 60-ish is good. Yeah, this is going to be nice. All right, done. Okay, going back, the histogram looks fine. Shadows, a little bit of clipping down here, I think, by the looks of it. Yeah, down in these areas, which is fine. That's natural. And nothing's clipping in the highlights, which is just what we want. All right, so uh, let's start again. Let's see if we can find an interesting um, color profile. Oh, that looks nice. I like that because it's got a slight tinge of like a green or a blue just in the midtones there, or in the shadows. That looks quite filmic and natural. Um, I think this one would be okay if you wanted that warm sun look. Um, but Bane really, the Bane character in the Batman movies really is quite cold. When you look at the Christopher Nolan movies with Bane in it, he yeah, a lot of the times he's in a scene where it's quite coolly the temperature is quite cold. So I think that actually looks nice as opposed to the original shot. So let's go with that. Close. If you want, you can also make it even colder. Um, or what we're going to do is we're going to go to our color grading and let's just see what we can do with it. So I'm going to pull the shadows down to blue. I'm going to go about halfway and then I'm going to ease back, but I'm just going to play around with the hue to see what that does. Okay, so you can sort of see the shadows going blue almost towards the green. So I'm gonna put it there for now. It looks a bit unnatural. Let's see what it does let's see what I can do with the highlights. I'm gonna go a bit warmer, warm, warm. Okay. Now here's where playing with the balance is going to be important. So at the moment there's way too much blue on his skin here. It doesn't look natural. So I'm just going to move it across to the warmer section, and instantly that looks much better. So I've taken out the blue from his skin and just made it a little bit more. It's still going to be cool and blue because he's in the shadows, but at least you can start to see some of the natural skin tone come back. So if you want, you can go all the way to the end. That also looks fine. In fact, that looks quite good. So I'm going to keep it there. All right. Now the other thing is, as I said, I've kind of gone a little bit extreme. So I'm going to pull it back just a touch. So it's subtle, so it's there, but it's not overpowering. And similarly with the highlights, I'm going to pull it back just a touch. So but I actually like it because it does look like that sunset shot that we were shooting him in. So that is good. Now, the other thing I like to do to give things a very filmic look is film usually has a slightly less contrasty look. And one quick effective way you can do that is just to raise the shadows, raise the luminance value in the shadows, or the brightness value of the shadows. So if you put your mouse on this thing, you'll see the L equals 0. That's the luminance. H is the hue, and S is the saturation. All right. So H197, saturation level of 29, and luminance of 0. So I'm just going to push the luminance up ever so slightly to about 20. Okay, if you go all the way extreme, you can sort of see it's very it gives you that washed out look that we had with the cloud strife image we edited before. Um, and if you look at the histogram, so notice how when I move this, it doesn't affect, it only affects the black, and what it does is it pushes the black away, but leaves the other part of the histogram untouched. So that's really important, very cool. So, and if I push it to the extreme, you'll start to see this is starting to look like the cloud stripe picture we edited before. And if we go back to that picture, what do we see? We can see that the blacks have been lifted as well, which is how you get that kind of washed out filmic look. So that's just a little trick that I learned that I like to apply to give it that sort of a look. So if we go back to gray and develop that, yeah. So that has that look. Now, if you think that's still that's a little bit too washed out, this is where you can use the contrast, the global contrast to pull it back a little bit. And I think that's good. That's looking really good. So just a quick before after. Before, after. Oh, much better, I think. I think that is much better. Okay. Lastly, let's bring out some detail, particularly in the eyes. I don't think we need to bring out too much detail here because that's good as it is, but I would like to see a bit more of his eyes and maybe a bit more of these, just add a bit of clarity to these hands and his collar. So let's do that. A little brush, give it a 20, sharpness of 20 as well. Make my brush size smaller, about the size of his eye, and just lightly paint once over that way. Similarly over his hands. This part just to bring out that definition in his hands. This part of his collar, just to frame him. And then a little bit down here. Get the detail of his costume out. And the leather, the straps and the buttons. Now this part is already blurred, so it would look a bit unnatural if I tried to make that, increase the clarity on that. But these parts are sharp, so a bit of clarity on that makes it pop a little bit more. So that's good. If you want, you can do a little bit more on his mask. There we go. You can start to see it's really sharp and it pops, and done. There we go. That's Bane. Um, Lastly, I'm just going to pop in a little bit of a vignette. Now, with this vignette, you want to be careful because he's not in the center of the image. He's a little bit to the side. So if I were to go too extreme, it's going to darken him as well, which I don't want. So just go a little bit more gentle than you normally would. just be conscious of that. Um, and I still think his face could be brighter. So I'm going to pop in a radial gradient and just very lightly brighten that part. I won't have to brighten this part too much because that's already lit up, but just this part here needs to be a little bit brighter. Okay, and just a very slight exposure bump. 3. That'll do. That'll do, donkey. That'll do. All right. Before, after, before, after. Yep, that looks really cool to me. Um, I don't think we need to do much more. If you want, you can be more extreme. You can play around with the clarity, but generally, too much clarity, you can start to see it's his skin tone suffers, right? You can see that his head starts to look like a rock rather than actual human a human head. So you don't want to go too crazy with the clarity. One thing you can do also with the vibrance and saturation, you can play with those. If you want a little bit more color, you can push the vibrance, and you can start to see that things like his collar, the blues become more vibrant. On his face, the reds almost go to orange. Obviously, the orange graffiti on the wall becomes very, very vibrant. So you want to be generally careful with vibrance. Generally, vibrance leaves the skin tones untouched, but in this case, because we've done such heavy grading with the color, it's affecting his skin tone as well. But usually, vibrance is good if you want to affect the environment or certain colors without affecting skin tone too much. So vibrance is good for that. Saturation affects everything. Everything, all the colors in the image get pumped up, no matter what they are. So if I do that, you'll see that everything goes up, everything. Um, so one interesting thing that I sometimes do is I will drop the vibrance down very low, and then I will push up the saturation, and you only see that things that are already vibrant in terms of their color is gets pushed up, but everything else sort of stays down. So it doesn't quite work for this image, but sometimes you may have an image like, let's say you've got a street image and someone's in a red shirt, and you want to give what you can do is you can desaturate the whole image in terms by of pulling down the vibrance, but then when you push the saturation back up, most of the image will stay um, desaturated, but the person in the red shirt will pop because of what you've done, and that could be a good way of calling attention to a particular subject in the image. But for this one, I don't think any of those things work, so we'll just leave it as they are. Um, and I think that's good. So quick review. Um, so we've got one of Blade, we've got one of Cloud, and we've got one of Bane. Uh, Three of them edited fairly differently, and my approach, although my approach I try to keep it more consistent in terms of how I look at that, and in terms of how the style that you've developed, you'll find that as you edit your images more and more, um, you may initially find that, oh, not quite sure what my style is, but you'll find that there is a particular look that you gravitate towards and that you like, and eventually your style will come out of that. So, but for now, as you're starting to learn and find out more about what you like creatively, it's okay to copy people, and it's okay to imitate them and learn from them, and pick out the bits that you really like. And then eventually, once you understand the process, you start to be more confident, and you go, you know what, I like this part, I'll keep going with it, but I want to change these other parts, or I want to ignore these other parts, and that's the way you should go. So last thing, so once I've done editing all my images, I need to export them, right? They don't do any good sitting in your hard drive. So um, you can either do them as a whole group. So I've just gone click and then hold down shift and click on the last image, and it will highlight everything. Or you can hold down control or command if you're using a Mac, and just select different images. But generally I'll just select everything, right click, export, and we'll go to export. So generally, the setting that I usually use is um, you can export. I usually export it to the same folder as my original folder, but I'll put it in a subfolder called edited, just so that it's separate from the raw images and it's easier to find. Um, you can rename your file. So I'll often rename it to, you can rename it to the person or the character that they're using. In this case, I'm just going to go cosplay April 24th, and then I'm going to start with a number one. So it's going to be cosplay April 24th, image 1, 2, 3. So when you do your export of the images and you pop it on the Google Drive for me to review, I suggest you use a number. That way, when I'm referring to the image, I can use the number as opposed to saying, oh, that image with Cloud Strife holding his sword behind his back. That's the image I'm talking about. It's a lot easier if there's a number. So yeah, let's settle to do that. Um, Now these settings are what's important. So you want your image format to be JPEG because that's the image format that's universally accepted by Instagram, Facebook, browsers, whatever. Color space is always sRGB because that's the color space that um, those platforms use as well. Um, Now, the quality of your JPEGs, it doesn't have to be 100. To me, I've gone, down to 70 or even 60, and I've never really noticed a difference in quality. So having it at 100 will make for quite a big file. So I usually reduce it to about, you know, between 70 and 80. If you want, can keep it at 70. That should be fine. Um, Now, this part, the image sizing, is the important bit. So I'll tick the resize to fit box and I will go long edge and I'll go 2160 pixels. Now, why 2160 pixels? Because that's the long edge resolution for a 4K image. Um, if you want, you can go 1080 pixels, which will make it a HD image, which is accepted everywhere as well. But I usually like to export these images and put them to my phone. And most phones, like the iPhone, for example, will allow you to view a 4K image. And with a 4K image, you can also zoom in when you're looking at the image on your iPhone, and you can still see the detail there. The other important part also is to keep it at resolution of 300 pixels per inch. Um, I think our phones have a resolution of um, up to like 200 pixels per image or even more. The Samsung Galaxy phones are like crazy in terms of your resolution. They've got 240, I think. Um, so if you pick 300, it'll more than cover that. That's fine. Um, Now, output sharpening. If you want, you can sharpen for screen. Um, the default is sharpen for screen and standard, and I've used that a lot of times. It's fine. Or if you want, you can just go low. I don't really think you can tell too much of a difference looking at your phone with it being so small. So if you look at, on a big screen on a computer, you probably may be able to tell a little bit of difference. But generally, keep it low or keep it standard. It's up to you. You can experiment with how, or you can even just turn it off. It's up to you. Um, Metadata, I'll leave that as copyright and contact info if you've got that set up in your Lightroom, but otherwise that's up to you. Watermark, I personally don't believe in watermarking my images. Look, if people will really want to steal your images, they'll do it whether you've got a watermark or not, and it just makes it difficult for the cosplayers as well. If sometimes they don't want to have a watermark. I mean, they will credit you anyway, so I don't really think you need a watermark. Plus, a watermark just looks, I don't personally, I think it looks ugly, having something down here or God forbid across the whole image, that just looks horrible. So my personal position is I don't think watermarks are necessary. They don't really do anything unless you're really trying to push your watermark brand. You've got your own personal branding, you want to push that. But for the stuff we do, we're not making money from it. The cosplayers will credit us, and if anyone wants to steal your image, a watermark's not going to stop them. So I'll leave that off. And post-processing after export, show in Finder or show in Windows Explorer, that just brings your image up for you to find, so it's easy. So what I'll do is I will go ahead and export with those settings, and then it will tell you that the files are being exported, and bang. So these are the images here. Now, it helps. One thing I always do is I will put these to my phone simply because that's where you're going to look at your images, all right? And the images will look different, once you've edited on your computer, it will look different if you look at them side by side on your phone compared to your computer. So I'm going to share these to um, my phone. Hopefully I'll come up. There we go. Doesn't like it. Anyway, I'll export these to my phone. I'll look at them on my phone. Um, and then if you're happy with how the image looks in terms of the color, the exposure or the brightness of it, then yeah, then that's fine. You're done. You can share them on Instagram or wherever you want to share them. But yeah, I always do this last step to check the font simply because the colors can look different between your screen and your phone, um, depending on whether your computer is color calibrated or not. It can look very different. So, yep, do this last step just as a final check, and then it's good to release. So that's it for now. So thank you again for bearing with me through this whole video. Um, if you have any questions on the editing at any process, at any part of the process, send me a message. I'm happy to talk through it with you. But otherwise, go through a first edit, put the images up into the Google Drive folders. I'll take a look at them and I'll give you back feedback on every single one of those images. And then if you wish, you can have another go at editing and then put them back on the Google Drive, and I'll have a look at them again. But other than that, yep, I hope you guys have a lot of fun. Oh, one more thing. After you edit your image, I find it usually helps to take a break, you know, walk away, do something else, have some dinner, have a coffee, and then come back. Or even better still, just leave it overnight and then next morning come back and have a look at it again. Because often you'll find that your eyes will get used to the colors. And sometimes when you come back and look at it, you think, okay, I think I've overdone this. I need to pull it back a little bit. So giving yourself a little bit of time to just sit and for your eyes to readjust back to normal again, and then coming back and taking a second look with fresh eyes, that also helps a lot. So all right, that's enough from me. Looking forward to seeing all your images and photos on that you'll share, and I will talk to you then. Thanks. Bye.